Good morning. I'm just out having a walk and it got me thinking about an assignment that I wrote last year. Now I have about half an hour or so to kill, so I thought I might as well talk about it because some of the information that I came across might be useful, or dare I say interesting to some of you. Now it's on dementia. We're going to focus on Alzheimer's disease, so if you're interested, keep watching. If you're not interested, then switch over and watch some funny cat videos or whatever. So I'll start by kind of the theory on dementia, so the different types and how it's caused, and then see where that takes me. Hopefully it's something more practical or useful. So when we talk about dementia, we tend to hear lots of different terms, and I've recently had a couple of people ask me what the difference is between Alzheimer's disease and dementia. The easiest way to think of it is that the term dementia is an umbrella term for over 100 different conditions that affect brain function, the most main one being memory. And Alzheimer's disease is just one of these types. So if you have Alzheimer's, you also have dementia. But if you have dementia, it doesn't necessarily mean you have Alzheimer's. You could have one of the other 100 different types. And which one you have is dependent on how it's caused and what area of the brain is affected. That being said, there tends to only really be four main types which account for the majority of cases, which I'll briefly mention. So coming in at number 4 is frontotemporal dementia or frontal lobe dementia, which, if it isn't obvious from its name, affects the frontal lobes of the brain, which is just behind the eyes. And because it affects that part of the brain, things that part of the brain are responsible for are then affected. So if someone's diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia, you'll find changes in motivation, planning, language, planning, organisation, personality, and quite often there's an increase in aggression and inappropriate behaviours, because they have what's termed disinhibition or lack of inhibition, which basically means the flag that goes up in our heads and says, no, that's not morally or socially acceptable to do, doesn't go up. So if they get the urge to slap someone's bum in a supermarket, they probably will. And frontal lobe dementia is thought to have a genetic cause, which is susceptibility to it is inherited. And it tends to be quite early onset, so between the ages of 40 to 50. And because it's frontal lobe, memory isn't always affected straight away. It can take many years for it to spread to areas of the brain that are responsible for memory. Coming in number 3 is Lewy body's disease or Lewy body's dementia, which is caused by a buildup of proteins in the brain, similar to Alzheimer's disease, because people with Lewy bodies tend to experience some of the same symptoms of Parkinson's, so bradykinesia and rigidity. They're at higher risk of falls, their poor mobility, and hallucinations are also quite common as well. The second most common is vascular dementia, and it accounts for roughly 1 in every 4 cases. It might also be called multi-infarct dementia, and that's because it's caused by infarcts in the brain. So what will happen is most commonly, someone will have a stroke, which is a blood clot in the brain, and because there's a blockage, oxygenated blood can't get to a particular area of the brain, which means that part of the brain then dies off because the cells can't function or survive without blood and oxygen. How that affects the person depends on what part of the brain has been affected. So it could be memory loss, poor planning, changes in personality, or if it's at the back of the brain, it could be blindness or paralysis. Finally, number 1, or the most common type, is Alzheimer's disease, which accounts for roughly 2/3 of all cases of dementia. So what is Alzheimer's? It's a chronic neurodegenerative disease, which basically means it's a brain disease which causes a decline in function over time. And this is different and much more severe than what we might find with normal aging. So what happens is cells within the brain start to die, and then there's also loss of synapses, which is kind of the communication pathways or channels between areas of the brain that neurotransmitters pass through. So not only does the brain start dying and become smaller, the sections within it then have trouble communicating with each other. No natural cause isn't actually known, and like most things, it's obviously under debate and being researched at the moment. Now, without the pathology of it all, there's 2 things which are looked for or thought to be a trademark of someone with Alzheimer's disease. The first is that there's a build-up of beta amyloid protein around the cells, which is sticky, collects a lot of rubbish, and then it becomes known as plaques. And then there's also a protein called tau, which is involved in maintaining the shape of the cells and the transport system, and this becomes twisted, and then that's referred to as tangles. Now, some people suggest that these plaques and tangles are what contribute to cell death and inhibit neurotransmission, whereas others tend to suggest that death's actually caused by something else, such as not being able to metabolize glucose because of insulin resistance or deficiency. So these plaques and tangles, whether or not they are the cause of Alzheimer's or a byproduct of something else, the key thing is that parts of the brain are gradually dying, and the communication throughout the brain is affected due to less neurotransmission and synapses. Now, one of the first areas of the brain to be affected in Alzheimer's is the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is involved in storing memories. So one of the first symptoms you might notice in Alzheimer's disease is the person having a poor short-term memory. Now, recalling older memories isn't too much of an issue at this point because they're already stored in a different area, but problems are noticed when the person's given new information or they're doing something which requires their working memory, such as cooking or making a cup of tea. So you might notice these slips in short-term memory. The problem is at this stage they're often put down to mistakes or just forgetting because you're getting older. It's common as well before the person has Alzheimer's to experience a period of mild cognitive impairment, or MCI, and that is the preclinical stage. So the key sign is short-term memory loss beyond what you would expect for normal aging. But for MCI, the effects aren't severe enough to affect your normal daily living. Just because someone has MCI, it doesn't mean that they'll go on to develop Alzheimer's. The speed that people progress is different. So it may only be 2 to 4 years for some people, or 8 to 10 for other people, before they're diagnosed with full dementia or Alzheimer's, if at all. But then for me, things like this that report time periods always have a big question mark over them, because the person could have had it for 2 years beforehand without knowing. So when someone progresses from MCI to Alzheimer's, you start to notice more psychological and behavioural changes in the person, and this is when it starts to affect their daily living. So the person might start losing interest in their hobbies, they might start missing appointments, taking longer time to recall names for objects or people, repetitive questioning, reading and writing becomes a little bit more difficult, coordination and muscle mass decrease, they're at greater risk of falling, they might become aggressive or even start wandering at night. And then when it becomes even more severe, mobility is massively reduced, often leading the person to be bed or chair ridden, which means they then become dependent upon carers. They forget their relatives' names. They can have trouble speaking or even swallowing. Obviously this will lead to things like malnutrition, reduced self-care. This puts them at greater risk of dehydration, infection, and lots of other conditions that become with being sedentary. And then finally, death. People don't tend to die from Alzheimer's specifically. It tends to be the comorbidities which come from that, so greater risk of a heart attack. So because there's this decline over time, steep for some, more gradual for others, the key then is to try and diagnose it as soon as possible, so that things can be done to try and slow down this decline. And other things can be put in place while the person's still of a stable mind to do so. Sometimes the diagnosis is actually a relief for the person because it allows them to understand why they're experiencing these changes, and family members can actually understand why their loved one is changing or acting a little bit differently. Then for other people, because it's incurable, they might see it as looking down a big black hole and become severely depressed, thinking about what's then to come. So there are a couple of problems with diagnosing it. The first is that to give an official diagnosis, it can only be done with an autopsy when they dissect the brain, which rarely happens when the person's still alive. So instead, ways in which they test someone who's suspected to have Alzheimer's is by testing brain functions. So doctors will try and rule out any other conditions that it may be. So they'll check for depression because they have similar symptoms. They'll check what medication you're on, whether you use drugs, if you have a disability which might lead to certain impairments. You might also need to have an STD test and a blood test for kidney and liver function and vitamin deficiencies. And once you have the all clear on these, you pretty much have to give a life history of yourself, and then often a relative's account of your life will be taken as well to see what changes they've noticed. After this, there's a series of tests which focus around people's orientation, around time and place. There'll be memory questions, concentration, cancellation, calculations, instructions to follow. You normally have to draw pictures of clocks and times. All the different tests to look at cognitive functions. Some people might have brain scans, so CT scans and MRI scans. The problem with that is it doesn't really show how well the brain is working. I read somewhere where they compared it quite well to, it's like trying to diagnose pain with an x-ray. You might see things that suggest that there might be pain or function, but you have to actually assess how well it's working before you can diagnose the problem. So there's all these cognitive tests, and a diagnosis can take several months of monitoring repeated tests just to identify these changes that are happening. And this is for Alzheimer's. Vascular dementia is normally easier to identify because it's caused by strokes, and you can see in brain scans quite clearly areas of the brain that have been affected. Now with Alzheimer's, you might see the hippocampus is a little bit smaller than normal, but then this could just be brain atrophy through aging. It doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with the function. So with Alzheimer's, you get these different pieces of information work as building blocks to help create this diagnosis. There's not a single measurement for a diagnosis, but there may be one soon. So brain scan may give an indication, families reports another, results of cognitive tests another, blood tests all clear another, and together these all kind of suggest that, okay, you're showing strong signs of Alzheimer's. Now there is some research at the moment going into biomarkers that might predict it, because we know that the disease process occurs years and even decades before we notice any symptoms in a person. So identifying those most prone, or those showing a deterioration before the symptomatic changes occur, can obviously mean that they can be treated sooner. And this could be a blood test. So at the moment they're looking at lipids and proteins, and smell test as well is something that's mentioned quite often, because our olfactory sense, our sense of smell, tends to decrease before we notice any other signs. So hopefully one day a diagnosis could be as simple as a blood or smell test. And then that brings us on to a problem. That's when someone goes to be tested or suspects that there may be something wrong. They're often already in the thick of it, and they're noticing changes in their day-to-day life already. So a diagnosis can actually come years after the person has started to suffer. And like I said before, this could be because mistakes and forgetfulness is just put down to getting older. But then if the person lives with someone else, they often compensate for them. So because he's not great at that, I do that in our relationship. So it actually masks the problem that they have. Again, meaning that they're coping with the condition and not quite ready yet, or need to do anything about it just yet. And that could be sustained until the person develops something themselves, and then all of a sudden it's realised that neither of them can do this. Or the person may pass away, and then all of a sudden Albert's Alzheimer's is a little bit more obvious than what it was beforehand. So the thought of an incurable disease and slowly deteriorate into nothing isn't something I'd put on my bucket list. So that kind of says to me, okay, if you can't cure something, you want to prevent it. And in order to prevent it, you need to identify the risk factors for it. And like most things, there's lots of contributing factors. Some of these are controllable, some of these are not controllable. Some have direct effects and some have indirect effects. Now there's loads of books and research papers on the topic. Let's go through all of these. So commonly or referred to a lot is age. Yes, you're more likely to develop it with age as you get older, but you can't control it, so just let that go. Genetics, again, you can't really control that, so when you forget that one. The only time genetics is important is if there's an early onset of Alzheimer's disease in the family, so before the age of 65. If you have someone, a parent, a sibling who's had that, then it's worth going to see a doctor and mentioning that. Gender, around 2/3 are female, but again, you can't really change that, and the sex change won't help you. That being said, there are some biases with the gender data, I think. So things that are a little bit more controllable then. Obesity, yes, obesity is controllable. Alcohol consumption, moderate to large amounts, can make you more susceptible. Being bilingual can reduce the risk. Use of steroids increases the risk. Those who have a high level of education tend to be diagnosed less than those with low level of education. Reliance on technology. I was reading a book recently that mentions a professor who's pushing this idea that technology like sat-navs is making our brains lazy, which can then increase the risk. Diet, high-fat diet and high sugar increases the risk. Vegetables and vitamins obviously help decrease the risk, and antioxidants. For infections like herpes, they can increase the risk. Smoking, too much, too little sleep, high cholesterol, diabetes. People with type 2 diabetes are twice as likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. So we have those potential risk factors which either directly or indirectly influence the development of Alzheimer's. And two common themes which incorporate most of them are exercise and diet. Now, exercise and diet can reduce obesity. Exercise and diet can reduce risk of diabetes, lower blood pressure. Exercise can increase social stimulation, reduce mental health like depression and anxiety, improve sleep, reduce stress, and all those things can have some contribution to the development of Alzheimer's. Not only that, the physiological benefits of exercise can reduce blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, risk of strokes, and therefore the risk of vascular dementia as well. How good is that? Exercise and diet can reduce the risk of developing two of the most common cases of one of the most devastating and upsetting diseases known to man, and women, especially women. Not only that, exercise reduces some of those risk factors or contributors, and also facilitates brain health and brain growth, which can then further reduce the risk. So when we exercise, it increases levels of BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which basically supports growth, function and neurotransmission. Obviously something which is quite important here. So exercise stimulates neurogenesis, which is the production of new neurons. There's an increase in blood vessels in the brain, which then increases the blood supply, nutrients, delivery to parts of the brain. There's an increase in synapses, which means communication within the brain is much more efficient. So taking those 3 to 4 things, we can see that exercise actually does the opposite to what Alzheimer's does. Alzheimer's increases brain atrophy. Exercise stimulates brain growth, especially in the hippocampus. Alzheimer's kills cells and reduces neurotransmission. Exercise increases neurogenesis and synapses. So there's no cure for Alzheimer's. Exercise can't cure it, but it can certainly help prevent it or delay its onset, and that's either by direct effects on the brain that I just mentioned, or it could be by indirect effects by reducing those contributors in causes such as diabetes, obesity, high blood pressure. And then exercise can also be used as a treatment to slow down that deterioration. So if someone already has Alzheimer's disease, it's predominantly by direct effects. So there are some important indirect effects as well, which can come from socialising, communicating, planning. Obviously it goes without saying that exercise helps the person maintain their physical abilities, so muscular function, bone strength and stability, because these will tend to decrease if the person becomes sedentary and a couch potato, which then just adds to the problem. So any Alzheimer's treatment should really be focused around slowing down that deterioration and maintaining whatever ability that a person still has. And exercise is just one very important way in which they can do that. They're also likely to give a medication. The main one being is one that prevents the breakdown of acetylcholine, because acetylcholine helps with communication between nerve cells. Now they only work in around 1/3 of people, but they have been shown to slow down this deterioration in the short term. They're not a long-term treatment, but it can help the person have an extra couple of months with what existing abilities they still have. But because it doesn't boost levels of acetylcholine, it just stops enzymes breaking it down. The amount that the person produces still decreases with the disease, which is why it only helps in the short term. So that's the first type of treatment people have. Now, depending on behavioural changes, if someone becomes aggressive or experiences hallucinations, they might also be given antipsychotics, and then antidepressants and mood stabilisers are also often prescribed. There are non-pharmaceutical treatments, so like cognitive and social stimulation and group activities. Some people might also have light therapy with the idea that it reduces the amount of melatonin in the body, which is the sleep chemical. So during the day they have this light therapy. It ensures the body clock keeps going, especially if they're often sat in a dark room, and this shows to reduce restlessness, improve sleep at night. And then a person's less likely to do wandering in the evenings, which is obviously beneficial for their safety. I recently actually finished a book called Alzheimer's Disease, What If There Was a Cure? Which is actually really interesting. It talks about this idea of using ketones, and briefly how it works. We typically find in the brain of someone with Alzheimer's is that the brain cells can't take in glucose, which is what they use for fuel. So because they can't metabolize glucose to produce ATP or energy, the cells gradually die. And Alzheimer's is something which has been referred to as type 3 diabetes, because there's some evidence to suggest that death of cells is because of this insulin deficiency and resistance, which we find with the well-known type 1 and type 2. So where the ketones come in, ketones don't need insulin to get into the cells, and they don't need glucose transporters to transport them into the cells. So these ketones can actually be used as fuel by the cells in the brain to produce ATP and survive. So this is what happens when people are starving to death. After a couple of days, our glucose levels are massively reduced or depleted. Our body then starts to produce ketones, which helps to keep our organs functioning. So if our brains weren't able to use ketones, then although our bodies would survive by metabolizing fat and muscle that we have, our brains don't tend to be able to use fat as fuel, and therefore we'd be quite an unintelligent species considering the feast and famine that we've always been exposed to. So this Mary who wrote the book, What If There Was a Cure, speaks a lot about 400 pages actually, how consuming coconut oil and MCTs can help people with Alzheimer's, because these MCTs, which are in coconut oil or in their pure form, are partly converted to ketones in the liver. So consuming coconut oil increases circulating ketone levels, which can then fuel the brain. So that's 400 pages summarised in 10 seconds. So it is interesting. So if you have someone or are caring for someone with Alzheimer's, it's worth having a look at the idea of ketones, because it works for her husband and lots of other people as well. And it could be a very simple dietary intervention which makes a very large difference. The last one that I'll mention is reminiscence therapy. This tends to be brought up a lot in books, and it's basically asking a person questions about their life to help them recall memories and maintain their identity. And there is some research which kind of suggests it improves their mood. The problem I have with that is that if the person has trouble recalling certain parts of their life, particularly things which are more recent, then this is surely actually going to increase their anxiety and make them even more worried and confused. Another problem is that people with Alzheimer's disease tend to live in past memories more than present memories. So there's the problem with, if they've forgotten about a death of someone, maybe their parent, a brother or siblings died, they bring them up, and then you have the decision to make as to whether or not you correct them and potentially upset them. So yeah, reminiscence therapy should be used with caution, I think, particularly if day to day you have to give a lot of prompts. I personally think it could do more harm than good. So that's short term. For long term, easier said than done, I know, but it's important to kind of accept the fact that someone has the disease, understand more about it, understand what's going to happen and what's going to come, and prepare yourself for that mentally, physically, financially, whatever you need to do. And then it's the case of making sure the person has and lives a fulfilling and comfortable life as possible, really. One of the things that I think is important is that just because someone's been diagnosed with dementia doesn't mean that they can't now do anything, or that it should now do everything for them. It's so important that they continue to make use of what existing abilities they do have. If they don't and you run around after them, then they're not going to do things for themselves, and soon they won't have the ability to do those things either for themselves. Another key thing is patience. It's really easy to lose patience with people when they're taking too long to do something or answer a question. When you have Alzheimer's, everything is a little bit more complex, harder to process. You yourself will know the answer, will be able to do what needs to be done very quickly, and it can lead to you taking control because it's easier and quicker. Unless you really have to, it's obviously best not to do that. There is a term used for these types of behaviours. It's malignant social psychology. It's a term which covers anything that carers or family members might do, such as labelling, blaming, disempowering, ignoring or undermining people who have disabilities or suffer from dementia. And it's not always something that's done intentionally. Much like with work, you might begin to slack or get bad habits. When you're caring for people, you might just start to do things yourself because it's quicker and easier, because you don't have the patience or time to allow them to do it themselves. So it's important not to use language and behaviours which might dehumanise or stigmatise someone. If a person was an amputee, you'd be patient with them, and you wouldn't get frustrated because they're taking a while. And I think there's that gap between how we treat physical disabilities and mental illness, probably because the latter is less visible, so we don't feel as guilty when we behave in these malignant ways. I'd also try and reduce the use of direct questions, so say things which would get the opinion on the topic rather than challenging them for an answer, because asking questions which demand answers can make them anxious and worried when they can't give them. So instead of saying, "Where have you been?" you could say, "It's quite nice out," and this can either produce no response, or the person could say, "I know, I've been here and seen this." Asking a direct question opens the possibility that the person can't answer, and they think, "I don't know, where have I been? Why don't I know where I've been?" So bring up a topic which you want to know information about. Removes the potential for all the psychological stress that comes with not being able to answer. But of course it depends what stage they're in. Earlier on, questions are okay when they're answerable. When they start to not being able to answer questions, it might be worth trying to get around that if you can, by mentioning a topic and seeing what information they can associate and provide for that topic. So if you're sat in a room of silence, instead of asking a question, bring up a topic they know a lot about and just let them talk. And usually it's a long-term memory, so bring up the war, bring up their childhood, where they lived. My name came from Birmingham, so I've said before, I haven't been to Birmingham in a while, and before I know it, she's talking about growing up there and being evacuated during the war, and she'll talk about that for half an hour. So the key thing, if someone's going through this, let's say, journey, we want to understand the areas affected, avoid frustration by reminding yourself it's not their fault, play to their strengths, make sure them and their home are safe, be patient, try and keep their independence as long as possible, encourage a good diet and exercise. Importantly, be prepared yourself as you can for what's going to come. You might be able to do that emotionally, but certainly things that are related to home care, finances, be aware of the strain that it can place upon yourself and other family members, and that's quite a big thing. So I'll finish by mentioning the carers. Now this could be a partner, a sibling, a daughter. It's more commonly daughters than sons that take this role. They're single-handedly the main reason why those with all cases of dementia are able to remain in their homes for as long as they do. Remove these family members and the person has no option but to go into a home. And as the person progresses through this disease, more and more responsibility is placed upon family members. It might start with shopping and bills. It can then go to cleaning and gardening, cooking and feeding. Not only that, because Alzheimer's is characterised by memory loss, it can actually be very upsetting when they forget who you are, and you're seeing and supporting this person who isn't really the person you once knew. They may accuse you of theft, they can accuse you of being an intruder, assault, or they might even assault you. And as things continue to get worse, there's a decision of, okay, I can't handle this anymore, I may have to put Jeff into a home. So the carer's health is just as important. It's common for them to experience anxiety and depression, particularly if you're an only child and are responsible for them just yourself. It's important that you don't take on too much, that you're sacrificing your own life and interests and relationships and family. If you're not an only child, then it's a good idea to have a family or sibling sit-down meeting just to discuss things, especially when big decisions need to be made, as that can prevent arguments and disagreements further down the line in the future, of people saying, "Oh, why did you do that?" or accuse someone of doing something for selfish reasons. So it's important, I think, as depressing as it sounds, as soon as you or someone else is diagnosed, to make sure your will's written, to make sure your needs written down. For example, if I lose my ability to do X or Y, I'm happy to be put into a care home. If I'm in a severe stage and have a heart attack, I don't want to be resuscitated. Identifying who your next of kin is or lasting power of attorney is, getting all this down as soon as possible can stop other people having to make such big decisions which could have lasting effects and consequences on them and their conscience. So don't put it off and cross that bridge when you come to it, because it might be too late when the person isn't in the right state of mind to make an informed decision. My nan's told us what she wants. Actually, she told us what she doesn't want. She told us that she doesn't want to be buried at sea because she can't swim. God bless her. So that's Alzheimer's. It's worth reading because statistically we're all going to come into contact with it, whether it's our grandparents, our parents, partners, or even us. And I'm not saying going for a run or sucking on some antioxidants or taking coconut oil is going to save you or stop you from getting it, but we can certainly take some steps now to reduce the risk and maybe make things slightly easier should it arise. Be well and goodbye.